From the outside, Marcos Alaves looked like the kind of man people admired without hesitation. At 42, he was a celebrated Brazilian commercial pilot, a man who had flown through the skies of more than 50 countries, trusted by multinational airlines, and respected by every crew member who served under him. His crisp uniform, his calm smile, and his steady posture gave the impression of a man who lived above the storms of life. People often said, "Marcos is blessed. He has everything." And he would nod politely, even though something deep inside him whispered the opposite. Flying had been his identity since he was a boy watching jets slice across the blue Rio de Janeiro sky. He worked hard, trained in the best academies, and built a future that promised stability and admiration. By the time he reached his late 30s, he had the money, the recognition, and the reputation that many dreamed of. Yet the irony was this: the higher he flew in the sky, the deeper the emptiness inside him became. His apartment was beautiful but silent. His relationships never lasted because he could not give what he did not have: peace. At night, when the city lights dimmed and the engine stopped humming in his ears, he felt something he hated to admit: loneliness. A strange heaviness in the chest, a feeling that despite all his achievements, something essential was missing. Something he could not name. He was raised in a Christian household, but faith had faded from his life years ago. Church became a childhood memory. Prayer became an old ritual. And God became a word he only heard during weddings or funerals. He didn't reject the idea of God. He just didn't feel anything toward him. Life was too busy, too fast, too success-driven for spirituality to fit in. At least that's what Marcos told himself. But on certain nights, after long flights, he would sit by the window with a cup of cold coffee and stare at the stars. In those quiet moments, the same silent question returned: why am I not happy? He couldn't understand how a man with a stable career, global travel, and admiration could still feel so hollow. It was as if he was carrying a weight that no one could see. A weight made of unspoken fears, hidden disappointments, and unanswered questions. He tried to bury it with work, new gadgets, expensive hobbies, and shallow friendships, but the emptiness always resurfaced, quietly, persistently. Then came the day of the London flight, a routine assignment, nothing remarkable. Yet Marcos woke up with a strange heaviness in his heart, as if something was waiting for him beyond the clouds. He didn't know that within hours his life would be ripped open, every illusion shattered, and every question he ever buried would collide with a reality he never believed in. He didn't know that the sky he loved so much would become the place where he discovered the truth he had been running from all his life. The morning of the London flight felt ordinary in every visible way. The weather in Sao Paulo was clear, the air smelled of jet fuel and coffee, and the airport buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Marcos walked through the terminal with the steady confidence of a man who had taken this route hundreds of times before. Nothing suggested that this day would be different. Nothing hinted at the storm, both physical and spiritual, that waited for him above the sea. He greeted his crew, reviewed the passenger list, and performed every pre-flight procedure with the same precision he was known for. His co-pilot, Rafael, joked about how uneventful the day looked. "No storms, no turbulence, easy flight. Maybe we'll even land early," he said with a grin. Marcos returned a polite smile, but something in his heart felt strangely unsettled. A quiet pressure he couldn't explain pressed against his chest. He brushed it off and continued working. Passengers began boarding, families with children, business travelers, elderly couples, tourists, all walking down the aisle with their own stories, unaware their fates were now tied to one man who himself didn't know where life was taking him. Marcos stood near the cockpit entrance, greeting them as professionalism required. But then something happened. Something subtle yet powerful enough to make him pause. A young Saudi man, dressed modestly in a light thobe, stepped onto the aircraft. Before crossing the threshold, he quietly raised his hands and whispered a short prayer. "Allahumma salim, Ya Allah, grant us safety." The words were soft, almost unnoticeable, but to Marcos they felt strangely heavy. It was the sincerity in the young man's eyes. the certainty, the trust. As if he knew, with absolute conviction, that someone was listening. Marcos found himself staring for a moment longer than he should have. What was that? He wondered. Why would a person talk to God with such confidence, such peace, as if God was right there beside him? In his entire adult life, Marcos had never prayed like that. Not with meaning, not with heart. He shook off the feeling, forcing his mind back to his duties. Yet the young man's quiet invocation echoed inside him. Ya Allah, grant us safety. As boarding completed, Marcos entered the cockpit, performed the final checks, and pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft lifted gracefully into the sky. Everything was smooth enough that Raphael repeated his earlier joke about arriving early. But the unsettling feeling inside Marcos didn't fade. Instead, it grew sharper, like a whisper he couldn't interpret. Hours passed over the Atlantic, and routine settled in. The engines hummed reliably, the atmosphere was calm, and the sky painted its endless blue horizon. Then, somewhere above the Mediterranean, a warning light blinked. A small signal, a single message on the panel. The kind that pilots don't ignore. Marcos leaned forward, brows tightening. Something was wrong. He just didn't know yet that this small warning was the first step toward the moment that would change his life forever. The moment when he would cry out for the first time in his life, Allah, if you are real, hear me now. At 36,000 feet, the world usually felt predictable to Marcos. The cockpit was his sanctuary, order, logic, control. But when the first alarm sounded, a sharp electronic cry slicing through the calm, something inside him jolted. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the sudden red flash on the screen. At first, it looked manageable. Overheating wasn't uncommon. Pilots were trained for it. Manuals covered it. Simulators rehearsed it. Marcos followed the protocol with steady fingers, adjusting airflow, monitoring pressure, communicating with Raphael. Everything seemed under control, until it wasn't. Within 90 seconds, the temperature spiked to unreal levels. The gauges began to jump, rattling as though the engine was screaming. Raphael stared at the panel in disbelief. "Captain, this isn't normal," he whispered. Before Marcos could respond, a violent vibration shook the cockpit. A metallic groan echoed through the fuselage like something large was tearing apart from the inside. Then, boom! A deep, gut-wrenching explosion rocked the aircraft. Oxygen masks dropped in the cabin. The plane lurched violently to the right. Warning lights erupted across the dashboard in a blinding storm of red. Hydraulics failing, electrical lines compromised. Pressure dropping, system after system collapsing like dominoes. Marcos grabbed the control column, but it felt heavier than ever before, sluggish, unresponsive, almost dead. Passengers screamed, flight attendants scrambled, babies cried. The entire aircraft became a chamber of panic suspended above an endless blue sea. "Mayday, mayday, faye," Raphael began, but the radio crackled, cutting him off. Another shudder hit. The plane dipped forward, nose tilting downward. Altitude began dropping, fast. Several thousand feet lost within seconds. Marcos's heart pounded violently in his chest. He had trained for emergencies all his life, but nothing resembled this. Every indicator he relied on flickered uselessly. The aircraft felt like a wounded animal, spiraling out of instinct, not command. Pull up, Raphael cried. "I am trying," Marcos shouted back, his voice breaking for the first time in his career. But the controls felt like stone. He saw the Mediterranean below, vast, open, merciless. The sea stretched endlessly, waiting with cold indifference. A terrifying thought entered his mind. We're going to die. For the first time in 19 years of flying, he felt truly powerless. Not professionally powerless. Humanly powerless. The passengers were no longer voices, they were souls depending on him. Mothers clutching their children, elderly couples whispering prayers, strangers holding hands because fear makes all humans family. In the chaos, something unexpected happened inside Marcos. A memory surfaced, the Saudi passenger whispering, "Ya Allah, grant us safety." The words returned like a heartbeat. Steady, clear, calming. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But for the first time in his life, Marcos felt the terrifying realization. Everything he controlled was now out of his hands. Everything he believed in, logic, skill, strength, was failing him. The sky had broken open, and so had he. And in that breaking, the seed of a prayer began forming inside him, a prayer he had never said before. The plane kept dropping, 500 feet, 1,000, 2,000, each second slicing away another piece of hope. Marcos gripped the controls so tightly that his knuckles turned white, but nothing responded the way it should. The aircraft trembled like a wounded creature, metal groaning under the stress. Every vibration felt like a countdown to the final impact. Raphael's voice cracked. "Captain, we're losing everything." His words weren't technical anymore. They were human, terrified. Marcos tried to steady the aircraft, but the control column resisted like it belonged to another world. It jerked violently with every downward tilt, and the horizon outside began to rotate as the jet slipped into a shallow spiral. The passenger's screams seeped through the cockpit door, raw, helpless, and heartbreaking. He glanced at the monitors, hydraulics, critical. Pressure, falling, altitude, dropping too fast. Stabilizers, not responding. It was a pilot's nightmare, except this one wasn't in a simulator where he could press reset. This was real. This was final. "Try manual override," Raphael shouted. "I did," Marcos yelled back. "It's dead. Everything is dead." A sharp alarm pierced the cockpit, the kind of alarm that had only one meaning: total systems collapse. The sea grew closer through the windshield, dark, cold, waiting. For a moment, time slowed. Marcos could hear his own heartbeat louder than the alarms. He looked at his hands, shaking uncontrollably. Had he ever seen them tremble before? Not even once in his entire career. So this is how it ends. A strange emptiness washed through him. Not fear, resignation. As if a lifetime of running from questions, from faith, from truth, had led to this single moment where everything caught up with him. His voice dropped into a whisper. "Raphael, I don't know what to do." The co-pilot stared at him, horrified. A captain never said those words, but Marcos meant them. For the first time, he truly had nothing left. He thought of his mother lighting candles in church. He thought of his failed relationships, of lonely nights in airports, of chasing a life that shimmered like gold but left him cold inside. Then, like a spark in darkness, the memory returned. That Saudi passenger lifting his hands, whispering with certainty, "Ya Allah, grant us safety." Why did those words come back now? Why did his heart react as if recognizing something ancient and forgotten? The aircraft jolted violently again. Oxygen masks swung like pendulums in the cabin. A child cried. A woman called out for God. A man begged for forgiveness. Everyone was calling someone, except Marcos. He had no one to call. His breath faltered. His eyes burned. And in that painful, terrifying moment, a realization hit him with the force of the sky itself. He was not in control. He had never been. His lips trembled as a desperate voice rose from a place he had buried all his life. Not logic, not training, not religion, just truth. "God, Allah, if you are real, please, hear me." The words escaped before he could think, carried by a broken heart surrendering for the first time. And the moment they left his mouth, the cockpit fell into a strange, indescribable stillness, as if the entire universe had paused to listen. For a heartbeat, nothing in the cockpit moved. The alarms kept flashing, the indicators remained in the red, and the aircraft continued its deadly descent. But something in the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't visible, it wasn't mechanical. It was internal, like a silent breath of calm cutting through the chaos. Marcos felt it first. A stillness, gentle yet powerful, pressed against his heart. Not relief, not safety, but a sense that he was no longer alone in that collapsing metal cage. He had whispered his first sincere prayer in 42 years, and the sky felt different. He didn't even know why he had said Allah. He had never prayed that word in his life. But in the moment when life peeled away every illusion, that name rose naturally, almost instinctively, as if his soul recognized where to turn even when his mind did not. Raphael looked at him with wide, confused eyes. "Captain, what did you just say?" Marcos could barely speak. I prayed," he whispered, his voice trembling. Before Raphael could process it, the aircraft jerked, but this time not downward. The spiral began to slow. The tilt reduced slightly. The nose lifted a fraction, barely noticeable yet undeniably real. Marcos blinked hard. "Raphael, did you feel that?" The co-pilot checked the readings. "Hydraulics. They're still failing, but Captain, look, pressure stabilized a little." It shouldn't have been possible. With the damage they had sustained, nothing should have stabilized, not even for a second. Marcos slowly wrapped his fingers around the control column again. The weight was still there, but now the resistance felt different. Less dead, more responsive, like the aircraft was waking up from a nightmare. A surge of hope shot through him. "Try the flaps again," he said. Raphael hesitated, then switched the lever. A faint vibration pulsed under their feet, weak but present. "They responded," Raphael gasped. "Captain, they actually responded." Marcos swallowed hard. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand, but deep inside something whispered, "He heard you." The alarm softened slightly. The violent shaking decreased. The nose lifted another few degrees. It wasn't enough for full control, but it was enough to fight the fall. Behind them, the passengers still cried, still prayed, still braced for impact. But the aircraft was no longer plunging like a stone. It was trying to live, trying to stay in the sky, just like Marcos. He exhaled shakily. "Raphael, we might still get out of this." "By what miracle?" Raphael shot back, stunned. Marcos's voice cracked. "I don't know, but something changed after the prayer." The co-pilot stared at him, stunned into silence. Outside the cockpit windows, the sea no longer rushed upward at terrifying speed. The horizon leveled slightly. The aircraft fought to regain balance, like an invisible hand steadied it. Marcos didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply bowed his head for 1 second, a second that felt like eternity, and whispered again, this time with intention, "Allah, don't leave us now." And in that moment, he knew. The sky had heard him. The one he called had answered. This was not coincidence. This was the beginning of a miracle. The next minute stretched like hours. Nothing about the aircraft was truly fixed. The systems were still damaged, the alarms still blinked, and the engines still groaned like they were moments from tearing apart. But there was a shift. Small, fragile, yet unmistakable. The plane was no longer falling like a dead weight. It was struggling, resisting, holding on. And so was Marcos. He tightened his grip around the control column, feeling a renewed strength settling into his arms. It wasn't physical, it wasn't adrenaline. It was something calmer, deeper, like a quiet assurance whispering, "You are not alone." Raphael scanned the instruments rapidly. "Hydraulics holding at 9%, he murmured, nearly disbelieving his own words. 9% is nothing, Captain. We should be spinning out of the sky." "And yet we're not," Marcos replied softly. Raphael looked at him, confusion and awe in his eyes. "What changed?" Marcos didn't answer immediately. Outside, the sea stretched endlessly, shimmering beneath the sunlight. Any other day, it would have been beautiful. Today, it was death. And yet the aircraft floated above it, not steadily, not safely, but with just enough control to keep fighting. Finally, Marcos said it, the truth he could no longer deny. I asked Allah for help. Raphael froze. You prayed? To Allah? Marcos nodded, his eyes fixed on the trembling horizon. Yes. And something answered. There was no arrogance in his voice, no attempt at grandeur, just honesty, pure, trembling honesty. Before Raphael could respond, the aircraft shook again, one long, violent tremor. Warnings lit up like fireflies. The left stabilizer reported partial failure. Airspeed fluctuated dangerously. But unlike before, fear did not consume Marcos entirely. He inhaled, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and whispered, "Guide me, please." When he opened them, his hands were steady. The ground proximity alarm blared, pulling them back into the urgency of the moment. "Altitude is still dropping too fast," Raphael shouted. "We need to level out more," Marcos replied. "With what control?" Raphael snapped. "All we have," Marcos answered, even though all was barely anything. But he pulled carefully, in small increments. He worked with what little the aircraft offered, adjusting pitch with almost surgical precision. And each tiny correction, each fraction of movement, felt impossibly smooth, as if unseen force was amplifying his every motion. The nose lifted another degree, then another. Altitude stabilized, still falling, but slowly now, manageably. "We might be able to reach land," Raphael said, disbelief trembling in his voice. "Athens is the closest," Marcos replied, diverting course. He turned the aircraft gently, expecting resistance, expecting another spiral. But the turn, though rough, held. Raphael blinked. "Captain, how are you?" "It's not me," Marcos whispered. The sky ahead began revealing a faint outline of distant land. It was still far, still uncertain, but it existed. For the first time since the explosion, hope felt real. Behind them, a child's cry softened. Someone whispered a prayer. A flight attendant sobbed quietly with relief as she held onto a seat. And in the cockpit, Marcos felt something settle deep within him. A tranquility he had never known. Not confidence, not skill, presence, as though the one he called had stepped into the cockpit with him. The plane was broken, wounded, fighting for every breath of air. But it was flying, and Marcos, for the first time in his life, felt guided by something greater than himself, guided by the God who had heard him. The approach to Athens felt like walking on the edge of a blade. The aircraft was still damaged, the alarm still flashed in angry red patterns, and every few minutes a new shudder shook the cabin as if reminding them how close death remained. But through all of it, Marcos felt something he had not felt since childhood: inner stillness. It was impossible to explain. The plane was injured, nearly broken, but it obeyed. His hands, once shaking uncontrollably, now moved with clarity he had never known. Every adjustment he made to the controls felt guided, as if each motion aligned with a strength beyond his own. Raphael kept staring at him, then at the instruments, then back at him. "Captain, this shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be flying, not like this." "I know," Marcos replied quietly. And yet they were. As the coastline came into view, faint at first, then sharper, brighter, Marcos felt an unfamiliar warmth rising inside him. Not adrenaline, not relief, something deeper, something that whispered, "You were heard." The closer they drew to land, the more vivid this inner whisper became, and with it came a strange feeling of humility, a realization that he had spent his whole life flying thousands of feet above the earth, believing he controlled everything, when in truth he could control nothing. Athens air traffic control gave them top priority. Emergency crews lined the runway. Helicopters circled above, broadcasting the moment live, though Marcos didn't know it then. The world held its breath for Flight 708. Inside the cockpit, Marcos's heart pounded, not from fear, but from awe. He whispered again, barely audible, "Allah, stay with me." Raphael heard it this time. He turned slowly toward him. "You keep saying that name." Marcos swallowed, his throat tightening. "It's the only reason we're still alive." Raphael exhaled shakily. He didn't understand, but he didn't argue either, not after what he had witnessed. As they neared touchdown, the aircraft shook violently, the damaged landing gear threatening to collapse. Marcos gripped the controls with all the strength he had left, but inside something else held him steady, something soft like reassurance. The wheels struck the runway with brutal force. The impact threw the passengers forward, oxygen masks swung wildly, and loose items crashed across the aisles. Smoke hissed from beneath the wings as the plane skidded, groaning under the pressure. But it stopped. It stopped. Silence filled the cabin. Pure, heavy, glorious silence. Raphael covered his face with both hands and cried. Flight attendants collapsed into seats, shaking. Passengers screamed in relief, kissed the floor, hugged strangers. But Marcos remained still. His hand stayed on the controls long after the plane stopped moving. His breath came out in broken waves, his eyes filled, not with fear, but with an overwhelming realization. He had called Allah, and Allah answered. Not with thunder, not with miracles in the sky, but with something far greater. Mercy. And as he sat in that cockpit, surrounded by life he should have lost, Marcos felt something inside him crack open. A doorway he had sealed shut long ago. A doorway leading to truth. The hours after the emergency landing passed in a blur, like fragments of a dream too intense to understand. Firefighters rushed in, paramedics assisted trembling passengers, journalists swarmed outside the terminal, and aviation experts called it the most improbable survival in recent years. People hailed Marcos as a hero, a legend, a man with extraordinary skill. But Marcos didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had just witnessed the truth. As he stepped off the aircraft, the cool Athens breeze touched his face. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, passengers cried and hugged him, but none of it reached his heart. All he could hear was the echo of his own voice in the cockpit. Allah, if you are real, hear me. And the quiet, undeniable response that followed. That night, the airline arranged a private hotel room for him. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his trembling hands. He had saved hundreds of lives. The world said he did the impossible, but he knew he hadn't done it alone. He knew what he felt in that cockpit. He knew something responded to him, a presence he had never believed in, yet somehow had called for by name. He opened his laptop out of habit, trying to read technical reports or news updates, but his fingers refused to type anything. Instead, he found himself searching for something he never thought he would. Why do Muslims call God Allah? Dozens of results appeared. Articles, videos, translations of Quran verses. One sentence caught his attention. Allah is not the God of Muslims only. Allah is the creator of all mankind. The words shook him. All his life he thought Allah was a foreign god belonging to another culture, another religion. But the explanation was simple, clear, universal. Allah meant the one true God, the same God he had tried to reach all his life but never knew how. He kept reading. He learned that Muslims prayed directly to God without any mediator, that Islam taught sincerity over rituals, that calling out to Allah even once in desperation was something the Quran described with breathtaking precision. Then he found the verse that froze him completely. When my servants call upon me, I respond. Quran 2:186. He felt the air leave his lungs. This was exactly what happened to him. Exactly. He whispered to himself, is this real? Did God actually hear me? A man who never prayed properly in his entire life? He leaned back, overwhelmed. His world, every belief, every assumption was unraveling thread by thread. The God he never knew had known him, had responded to him. The days that followed were filled with official interviews, pilot debriefings, and endless praise. But inside, he felt more lost than ever, not in confusion, but in awakening. It was as if his heart, silent for decades, had begun beating for the first time. Passengers sent him letters thanking him. A little girl drew him a picture of an angel holding up a plane. A Muslim man wrote, "You called Allah in truth. He answers truth." Marcos held that letter for a long time. At night, he lay awake whispering the same question over and over. Allah, why did you save me? He didn't know the answer yet, but he knew one thing. The one he had called in fear was now calling him in peace. The more Marcos tried to return to his normal life, the more impossible it became. He went to pilot debriefings, answered technical questions, and attended official meetings, but every conversation felt hollow. The world wanted to talk about the miracle landing, but Marcos wanted to talk about the moment before the miracle, about the prayer that slipped from his heart, and the peace that followed. For the first time in decades, he wasn't searching for success. He wasn't searching for applause. He was searching for God. One afternoon, while walking through the streets of Athens, he passed by a small building with a green sign that read, Islamic Cultural Center. He stopped. His heart felt a strange pull, not fear, not curiosity, something deeper. The same warmth he felt in the cockpit brushed against him again. Without fully understanding why, he stepped inside. The interior was calm, no statues, no paintings, no decorations, just peaceful emptiness. A man with a kind face greeted him gently. "Welcome. How can I help you?" Marcos hesitated. His voice cracked. I think I need to understand something about Allah." The man's eyes softened immediately, as if he had heard this many times. "You've come to the right place. Sit with me." They sat. Marcos told him everything about the engine explosion, the free fall, his trembling hands, the moment he whispered Allah, and the impossible way the aircraft steadied afterward. He didn't exaggerate or dramatize. He simply spoke truth. When he finished, the man said quietly, "Allah says in the Quran, 'When you call upon me, I respond.' You called him with a sincere heart, and he answered." The words washed over Marcos like warm rain. "So, Allah heard me? Me? Even though I'm not Muslim?" The man smiled. "Allah is the Lord of all people, not one group, not one nation. He hears every sincere call. Islam does not claim Allah as ours. We belong to him." A lump formed in Marcos's throat. He whispered, "I feel drawn, like something is pulling me closer." The man nodded gently. That is guidance. When Allah wants good for someone, he opens their heart, slowly, softly, until they recognize truth by themselves. Marcos lowered his gaze, overwhelmed. "I've prayed more in the last few days than in my whole life. I don't know how to pray. I don't know the religion, but when I say his name, Allah, I feel at peace." "Peace is a sign," the man said. "A soul recognizes its creator even when the mind is still learning." Marcos looked around the quiet room. "Can I see the Quran?" The man brought him a translation. Marcos held it with trembling hands and opened it at random. The first verse his eyes landed on read, "Do not fear, I am with you." His breath caught, his eyes stung. He closed the book and whispered, "That's what I felt in the cockpit, that exact feeling." The man nodded again. When Allah saves someone's life, it is not only from death. Sometimes it is from ignorance. As Marcos walked out of the center, the sun felt brighter, the air softer. He wasn't a Muslim yet, but he was no longer the man he had been. Something inside him had turned, slowly, silently, toward the truth. He wasn't searching for Allah anymore. He was moving toward him, and his heart knew the journey had truly begun. In the days that followed his visit to the Islamic Center, Marcos felt as though he were living between two worlds. One was the life he had always known: fame, routine, technical talk, material success. The other was something entirely new and indescribably alive, a world where peace came not from control, but from surrender. Surrender to the God he had called upon in his darkest moment. At night, he would sit on the hotel balcony staring at the sky, the same sky that had nearly become his grave. Now it felt like a witness, silent, vast, and sacred. "Why me?" he would whisper. "Why did you save me?" Each night the same warmth touched his heart, the same quiet reassurance that had steadied him in the cockpit. And slowly the answer formed within him. Because Allah wanted to guide you. One morning, while reading more about Islam, he paused at a verse that struck him deeply. Allah chooses whom He wills to guide. He closed his eyes as tears rolled down his cheeks. For the first time in his life, he felt chosen, not for success, not for applause, but for truth. But the real turning point came unexpectedly. He returned to the Islamic Center to thank the man who had helped him before. This time, the prayer hall was filled with soft murmurs of afternoon worship. No music, no rituals, no images, just rows of people bowing their heads in humility. Marco stood at the doorway watching. As each man bent into prostration, something inside him broke open completely. They weren't bowing out of fear, they were bowing out of love. It hit him with overwhelming force. This is what my soul has been searching for. The man approached him with a gentle smile. Your heart seems full today. Marcos nodded, struggling to speak. It is full of something I can't explain. Then let your tongue speak what your heart already knows, the man replied. Marcos took a shaky breath. What if I want to become Muslim? The man's eyes softened with joy. Then say the testimony of faith. With sincerity, it will transform your life. Marcos felt his heart pounding, not with fear, but with clarity. Every moment of his journey flashed before him. The explosion, the free fall, the prayer, the impossible stabilization, the peace, the Quran, the signs, all pointing to this one moment. He raised his gaze, tears shimmering. The man recited the words slowly, and Marcos repeated them with a trembling voice. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasul Allah. I bear witness that there is no God except Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. As the final word left his lips, an indescribable peace flooded him. It felt as if a heavy cloak he had worn his entire life had suddenly fallen away. A warmth enveloped him from within, gentle, pure, transformative. He wasn't the same man anymore. He wasn't lost. He wasn't empty. He wasn't alone. He had found the one who heard him. And more beautifully, Allah had brought him home. When he stepped out of the center that day, the world felt new. Not because it had changed, but because he had. Marcos walked toward the sunlight with a heart filled with gratitude and purpose. His life had almost ended in the sky, but in that same sky, Allah had written for him a new beginning. A beginning of faith, truth, and guidance. A beginning as a Muslim.